Paula McLain is a great favorite of the customers and staff of Politics and Prose, and we are so delighted to welcome her here for the very first time for her new novel, Circling the Sun. She is the author of respected collections of poetry, a memoir, and a debut novel, A Ticket to Ride. But it was her second novel, The Paris Wife, that deeply connected with readers and set the publishing world on fire. It was an instant bestseller and spent over a year on the bestseller lists. Here at P&P, we could barely keep it on the shelf. It answered a question that every true lover of literature had asked themselves. I know I did when I read A Movable Feast. What about Hadley? It gave voice to the voiceless Hadley Richardson, Ernest Hemingway's first wife, who had accompanied him through the bacchanalia of 1920s Paris. McLain's new novel delves into the internal landscape of another real but underdocumented heroine, the aviatrix Beryl Markham, and her life and loves in 1920s Kenya. Jean Zimmerman writes for NPR, as chronicled in Paula McLain's richly textured new novel, Circling the Sun, Beryl Markham's life is the stuff of legend. McLain has created a voice that is lush and intricate to evoke a character who is enviably brave and independent. The Boston Globe writes, a worthy heir to Isaac Dinesen, McLain will keep you from eating, sleeping, or checking your email. So, like Africa, as it's so gorgeously depicted here, this novel will never let you go. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Paula McLain to Politics and Prose.
Wow, thank you, Liz. I am so psyched to be here. This is my inaugural visit to Politics and Prose, where I've always wanted to come because they take books and writers and writing so seriously, and why wouldn't I want to be a part of that? And I've never done an event in DC before, so woohoo, right? Yeah, I'm excited. And don't you love the word aviatrix? Doesn't it remind you of dominatrix? Right? And isn't that cool? And doesn't that also evoke Beryl Markham? I think it does. All right. So I'm just going to talk for 15 minutes and maybe read for like 5 minutes and take some Q&A. And then if there's no questions, then I might have to twirl a fire baton. So start thinking of questions for me, and that'll make things so much more fun for everyone. All right. So you heard Liz, like I have what is, arguably a pretty schizophrenic publishing career. In the 1990s, I went to graduate school at the University of Michigan to study poetry. And I don't think I have to tell you that, poetry is not the way to get rich and famous, right? When you publish a collection of poetry, which you've slaved years and years and years for, the door prize is to get a box of your own books in payment, and then you get to drive all over the Midwest schlepping your own books at community colleges, which is not much more glamorous than schlepping your books out of your own car in a Safeway parking lot. So, but that's what I aspired to. That's what I aspired to. And then I wrote a memoir about growing up in foster care in the Central Valley of California in the 1970s and 80s, which I did. And I wrote this debut contemporary novel. And then something pretty magical happened. But first I had to get lost. I had to get good and lost. So when the memoir came out, that was 2003. It was Little Brown. I had a New York agent. I had a New York publisher. I got to get in my car and drive to Minneapolis and do radio and TV and sit in green rooms. My average attendance at those events was 3 people. Sometimes there were 5 people, 2 of whom I knew, and that was kind of a bumper crop. And when the novel came out, literally one night I drove for 3 hours from my home in Cleveland, through a blizzard to Pittsburgh to a Joseph Beth. Does anybody remember Joseph Beth? This was a great store, but they went under, unfortunately. But to go to a Joseph Beth, literally one person was there. They had 50 chairs lined up, and one person was there, and I loved her. I'm we don't even have to talk about me. Let's talk about you. You want a coffee? Come on, let's go to your house. Let's watch TV. Let's not do this. This is mean. And I'm pretty scrappy. It's not like I was going to stop writing. I certainly wasn't going to stop writing, but I started to think, that all the good ideas had been, stolen by other writers, and that's why I hadn't had one. And I would go to the bookstores and I would go to the tables and read the flap copy and turn a book over and look at the description and think like, damn, I can't have that idea either. And they're all gone. And that's why it's never going to happen for me. And then, quite by accident, I picked up a copy of Hemingway's A Movable Feast and had that question. As Liz mentioned, please come sit down. There's a chair here. No, you're sure? Yeah. I have an excess of maternal energy. Sorry, I can't help myself. And I just thought, who is this woman and where has she been and why don't I know about her? And how did these two young lovers meet? And how did they get to Paris? And then what happened? And why didn't they get to keep each other? And it just completely electrified my imagination. My curiosity woke up. I had never been to Paris. And so I just pitched myself kind of deliciously at this idea, a movable feast from Hadley's point of view. And I slurped up biographies. I found out that there was a cache of love letters. So when Ernest and Hadley met at this party in Chicago in 1920, for the next 11 months, they kind of, ripped up the postal lines between Chicago and St. Louis and wrote thousands of pages of love letters. And they were in a library in Boston, and I could go there and read them and just swim in her voice and her consciousness. And that's how I built that book, from her voice. I didn't have permission to use her words, but something about her voice just really latched onto me, and it didn't let me go. And it gave me the confidence to think that I could put Hadley in Gertrude Stein's salon and know what she was thinking and feeling, Like that takes some chutzpah, right? I didn't know what I was doing. Historical fiction, what? I'm a poet, right? So a little ignorance kind of went a long way. And you know what happened with that book, right? Crazy, crazy things happened with that book. On the New York Times bestseller list for a year, there are no detectives in my novel, Nobody dies on page 3. There's no pornography. This is a book about writers. I kept thinking like the world was getting it wrong or something, but it was special. It was special. It was special to me. Something really extraordinary happened when I found Hadley. And I feel like for the first time, even though I'd been writing books for 12 or 15 years at that point, and mostly thinking that when you wrote a book, nothing happened except heartbreak, for the first time, my gifts as a writer were being completely made use of. And my empathy was woken up in a way that it hadn't ever been before. And my curiosity, and it sort of compelled me to do things with language that I'd never done before, and to take on, for instance, chapters from Hemingway's point of view. Like, who would do that, right? Some crazy poet would do that. And it was very special, and changed my life forever, and also ruined it simultaneously, right? I mean, how could it not sort of ruin me? Because I couldn't write after that. I couldn't write after that because I'd already fallen in love once. You know how it is? You go through a terrible divorce, and all your friends are shoving men at you, and you're like, I'm not ready. I'm not ready to date again. And that's how I felt. Like I had fallen madly in love with Hadley, with that world, with Ernest. I believed. I wrote that book in a Starbucks near my house in Cleveland, Ohio. And the obvious joke, of course, is, how far can you possibly get away from a Parisian cafe? And it is a Starbucks in Cleveland. And that's where I wrote that book, believing that actually every day in my little brown, ratty, velveteen chair, listening to, Nora Jones and having a latte, that I was in Paris in 1922. And I didn't know how I was going to find another subject that could captivate me so powerfully. And I suffered for a couple of years and had ideas and then couldn't follow them. For 2.5 years, I was working on a novel about Marie Curie. Like, that should work. She's fabulous. She's incredibly inspiring. It's in Paris. You know, maybe there's not so much sex, but there's radium. And I couldn't get there. I couldn't find her voice. That should be a tagline somewhere, right? No sex, but radium. I couldn't find the point of view. I was completely underneath my research. I mean, honestly, I know more about physics in 1894 than any human should know, except for, Marie Curie. And the book didn't work, and my editor was bored and told me so. And she's like, oh my God, the science, Poor Marie in her laboratory, like stirring her pitch blend. And I kept saying, but it's Marie Curie, right? I mean, she is a scientist. And then there was a while that I cried every day when I tried to write because it wasn't happening. And I started to despair. And then I went on vacation with my sister and my brother-in-law to Orlando, Florida. And you're like, nothing's going to happen there. And he is a doctor, but he's also a pilot. And he was reading this book called West with the Night, which I'd never heard of. And he kept looking up from the side of the pool and saying, oh my God, you need to know who this woman is. She is phenomenal. This is the one, You need to pay attention. And, he's my brother-in-law. I ignored him. Of course. And then he ignored me right back. And he shoved it in my hands. And he's like, no, you need to pay attention here. This woman is going to be important to you. And I took the book home, and it moldered on my dining room, bookshelf for literally about another year. And then one day, literally, whatever, in the pit of despair, I picked it up, read one paragraph, and all the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. And I just thought, shit, what have I been doing? Why have I been suffering? Because here she is. And I didn't really know anything about her life, but I knew with utter conviction that I was going to write about her. And it's been really, really fun. But, when I started reading, Hands, West with the Night, do you guys know this book? Yay! You're already on Team Beryl. Yay! I didn't know the book. I didn't know West with the Night, and I didn't know Beryl's accomplishments. So if you don't know her life, what she's mostly known for was being the first woman to fly the Atlantic solo east to west the hard way, as opposed to Amelia Earhart's, the easy way. And I thought two things. First of all, why don't I know about her? Why hasn't her accomplishment kind of followed her? Why hasn't it left an impression in our history and in our imaginations in the same way that Amelia Earhart's have, or Charles Lindbergh's even, right? Like Amelia Earhart is America's sweetheart, and Beryl Markham is nobody. Most people don't remember her. Why is that so? So I had that question. And then there was just the rollicking kind of Calamity Jane idea that here was a woman that I wanted to ride shotgun with. Because if you read West of the Night, you know that mostly she just remembers her most daring adventures. So there's the transatlantic flight. There's racehorse training, because Beryl was the first licensed female racehorse trainer in the world when she was 18, She was a bush pilot. She was the first person, in fact, she pioneered the act of scouting big game from the air for safari hunters, which was incredibly dangerous. And she was a badass. Right? She was a badass, and I just thought, now this is going to be a lot of fun. So I started working on the book, and mostly I was just so excited not to be in a laboratory in Paris stirring pitch blend, right? I was in Africa, having a roaring good time. I was on horseback. Beryl was attacked by a lion when she was 10 years old. I'm like, and now today I get to be attacked by a lion, Things are exciting in Cleveland today. But then when I started reading biographies about Beryl's life, right? Because I just found these huge gaps. So if you know West with the Night, all you really know is that she did all these incredible things. And then you start to wonder, like, wait a minute, she was married 3 times. There's not a single mention of one of her husbands, right? And then you read a little further and you're like, oh, wait, for 10 years, she was involved in a juicy love triangle with Karen Blixen, who later wrote Out of Africa under the pen name Isak Dinesen, and Dennis Finch Hatton, who, Be Still My Heart, was so beautifully played by Robert Redford in Out of Africa. Hello. 10 years. Karen Blixen's not in Beryl's book. Beryl's not in Karen's book either. And that's when I knew I had a really good story. Like, this was going to be a lot of fun. The surprising part for me was, even though I knew I had a great story, I had a great heroine, I had a great voice, here was Calamity Jane, she was going to be on horseback, she was going to take the world by storm, and all this great stuff was going to happen. What I was surprised by was her, the loss and calamitous loss, actually, and great suffering that Beryl endured that she never once intimates in West with the Night. You don't get any sense of vulnerability, and yet I kept learning about all of this, as I say, loss. So what you don't know from reading West with the Night, for instance, is after Beryl's father, so Beryl was born in England, and then when she was 2 years old, Beryl's father transported the whole family to colonial Kenya. It wasn't even Kenya then. It was the British East African Protectorate. And they go 100 miles up country from Nairobi, where there's 1,500 acres of bush and nothing but 3 weather-beaten huts. And 2 years after they're there, when Beryl's 4 years old, her mother can't take it anymore and gets on the train and goes back, and then the ship, and goes back to England and disappears, abandoning her. And essentially, Beryl kind of reforges herself, and her entire identity is reshaped. By the Kipsigis tribe on her father's land. She takes a new name. She's Lakwet, and she hunts warthog, and she takes down, pigeons with a slingshot, and she becomes this fierce, wild, headstrong, take charge kind of girl. But I started to believe that she could only forge that identity because of what she'd already lost. And then more loss happens when she's 16. Her father goes bankrupt and loses this horse farm, which she loves more than anything in the world. And before she's 17, she's plunged into a disastrous marriage to a man twice her age. And the only way she can get free again, because what recourses do women have, right, is to turn to horses, the only thing she knows, and she gets licensed as a racehorse trainer. It doesn't exist. She has to invent it because it's the only way she can be independent. And sometimes feminism is really doing what you can to stay alive, and I think that's sort of phenomenal. And I think Beryl's sort of phenomenal. But there are eerie connections between Beryl's story and my story. I wrote a memoir about growing up in foster care because my mother abandoned me when I was 4. I know, and I got chills when I read this detail. I was already writing the book when I learned this detail. Beryl's mother came back when she was 20, just sort of turned up one day. My mother came back when I was 20 and just turned up one day and made things really difficult and complicated, and I still know her, and it's still complicated. And I just started to think, like, it's sort of a fluke that I found this book, and it's sort of my fate that I found this book. And I believe that. I believe I have a profound connection to this woman that no other writer could sort of take on her story in quite the same way. And no other writer would be interested in the kinds of things that I'm interested in. You know, there's her transatlantic flight. There's so much great material once she takes to the sky and kind of finds her wings. I write about her relationships. I write about her mother. I write about this stuff because I'm interested for really particular reasons, because I've attached to her consciousness and her point of view in really particular ways. So I'm just going to read from the early section of the book for like 5 minutes, and then maybe you guys will ask some questions. So this is Beryl. Before Kenya was Kenya, when it was millions of years old and yet still somehow new, the name belonged only to our most magnificent mountain. You could see it from our farm in Njoro, in the British East African Protectorate, hard-edged at the far end of a stretching golden plain, its crown glazed with ice that never completely melted. Behind us, the Mau forest was blue with strings of mist. Before us, the Rongai Valley sloped down and away, bordered on one side by the high, strange Menengai crater, which the natives called the Mountain of God, and on the other by the distant Aberdare Range, rounded blue-gray hills that went smoky and purple at dusk before dissolving into the night sky. When we first arrived in 1904, the farm wasn't anything but 1,500 acres of untouched bush and 3 weather-beaten huts. This, my mother said as the air around her hummed and shimmered as if it were alive. You sold everything for this? Other farmers are making a go of it in tougher places, Clara, my father said. You're not a farmer, Charles, she spat before bursting into tears. He was a horseman, in fact, my father. What he knew was steeplechasing and fox hunting in the tame lanes and hedgerows of Leicestershire. But he had seen paper flyers hawking cheap imperial land, and an idea had latched onto him that wouldn't let go. We left Westfield House, where I was born, and traveled 7,000 miles, past Tunis and Tripoli and Suez, the waves like great gray mountains swallowing the sky, and then through Kilindini Harbor in the port of Mombasa, which smelled of sharp spices and drying fish, and on to the snaking train bound for Nairobi, the windows boiling over with red dust, and I stared at everything, completely thrilled in a way I hadn't remembered ever feeling before, because whatever this place was, it was like nothing or anywhere else in the world. We settled in and worked hard to make our situation livable, pushing against the wildness while the wildness pushed back with everything it had. Our land had no visible borders or fences, and our huts lacked proper doors. Silky, banded colobus monkeys climbed through the burlap sacking covering our windows. Plumbing was unheard of. When nature called, you walked out into the night with all the things that wanted to have at you and hung your derriere over a long drop, whistling to keep your fear away. Lady and Lord Delamere were our nearest white neighbors, a 7-mile hack through the bush. They were Baron and Baroness, but their titles didn't save them from sleeping in the typical mud and thatch rondavels. Lady D kept a loaded revolver under her pillow and advised my mother to do the same. But she wouldn't. She didn't want to shoot snakes or her dinner. She didn't want to drag water for miles to have anything like a proper bath or to live without company for months at a time. There was no society. There was no way to keep her hands clean. Life was simply too hard. After 2 years, my mother booked passage back to England. My older brother Dickie would go too, since he was always so frail and wouldn't weather Africa for very much longer. I had yet to turn 5 when they climbed aboard the twice-weekly train to Nairobi with steamer trunks and handkerchiefs and traveling shoes. The white feather in my mother's helmet trembled as she kissed me, telling me I should keep my chin up. She knew I'd be fine, since I was such a big, strong girl. As a treat, she would send me a box of licorice bobs and pear drops from a shop in Piccadilly which I wouldn't have to share with a soul. I watched the train recede along the still black line of the track, not quite believing she could actually go. Even when the last shuddering car was swallowed up by distant yellow hills and my father turned to me, ready to head back to the farm and his work, even then I thought the whole thing was a mistake, some terrible misunderstanding that would all get sorted at any moment. Mother and Dickie would disembark at the next station or turn around at Nairobi and be back the next day. And when that didn't happen, I kept waiting just the same, listening for the far-off rumble of the train, one eye on the horizon, my heart on tiptoe. For months there was no word from my mother, not even a dashed-off cable. And then the sweets arrived. The box was heavy and bore only my name, Beryl Clutterbuck, in my mother's curly-cued script, but even the shape of her handwriting, those familiar dips and loops, instantly had me in tears. I knew what the gift meant and couldn't fool myself anymore. Scooping the box into my arms, I made off to a hidden corner where, trembling, I ate up as many of the sugar-dusted things as I could stand before retching into a stable bucket. Later, unable to drink the tea my father had made, I finally dared to say what I feared most. Mother and Dickie aren't coming back, are they? He gave me a pained look. I don't know. Perhaps she's waiting for us to come to her. There was a long silence, and then he allowed that she might be. This is our home now, he said, and I'm not ready to give up on it. Are you? My father was offering a choice, but it wasn't a simple one. His question wasn't, will you stay here with me? Because that decision had been made months before. What he wanted to know was if I could love this life as he did, if I could give my heart to this place, even if she never returned and I had no mother going forward, perhaps not ever. How could I begin to answer him? All around us, half-empty cupboards reminded me of things that used to be there but weren't any longer. 4 china teacups with gold-painted rims, a card game, amber beads clicking together on a necklace my mother had loved. Her absence was still so loud and so heavy I ached with it, feeling hollow and lost. I didn't know how to forget my mother any more than my father knew how he might comfort me. He pulled me, long-limbed and a little dirty, as I always seemed to be, onto his lap, and we sat that way quietly for a while. From the edge of the forest, a group of hyraxes echoed shrieks of alarm. One of our greyhounds cocked a sleek ear and then settled back into his comfortable sleep by the fire. And finally, my father sighed. He scooped me up under my arms, grazed my drying tears with a quick kiss, and set me on my own 2 feet. Thank you. So, I'm hoping you have questions. Thank you, by the way. It was really a pleasure. It's a pleasure to read from the book because it just came out yesterday, which is really exciting, right? Yesterday. And the word is launch. The real word, the business word is on sale. But I love the word launch. We've launched. Beryl and I have launched. So please, anything. You can ask me anything, or I'll have to tap dance, and then that will be bad. I love your dress, by the way.
Thank you.
Oh. Oh, you're at the mic. I was warned by Liz and then immediately forgot. Sir, please.
Thank you.
Yes.
Someone has to go first.
Indeed. At everything.
I found your description of the farm in Kenya quite evocative. Did you visit Kenya as part of your preparation for writing this book?
I did go to Kenya. I did. But that's the second part of my answer is a little more complicated. I only went to Kenya after I finished the book.
Aha.
I only went to Paris after I finished the book because I was broke. I had quit my teaching job so I could write in the Starbucks near my house in Cleveland, and I didn't have 2 dimes to rub together, and so I invented Paris. Ernest Hemingway would roll over in his grave to know I went on Google Earth. I went on Google Earth to find out like where Hadley was going from her apartment, Cardinal Lemoine down to the Seine. And I read everything I could find, and I sort of plunged myself into this place that I had imagined. And after the book sold, I was able to go there finally, but in a way, in that order. And then suddenly it was like a way to commune with my characters and to pay tribute to the way I'd already lived in their minds and hearts. And so going there was like a pilgrimage, and it was like going to church. And because it worked so well, and because I'm superstitious, I didn't think I should go to Africa until after I had finished the book. And something really, it's kind of crazy, right? And certainly the fraud police are circling even at this moment. But something really powerful happens to you when you have to activate your imagination. And something also happens. I just believe sometimes the subconscious knows more than we do, right? And the rational parts of our brains that are always making sense and order can sometimes get in the way, and our research can get very precious. My research with Marie Curie, for instance, I could build an ionization chamber for you right here, right now. And so I imagined Africa and read everything I could and was transported by words like escarpment. I'm like, what is an escarpment? That's fabulous. And then I went on Google Earth, and you know what it is? It's a hill. But Nairobi, for instance, Nairobi is a city of 4 million people. Beryl's Nairobi was tin shacks and goats and a bazaar, and the Mutega Club, which, by the way, is still there. Not much change since 1913. Beryl's father's farm in Njoro is still a horse farm, and I was able to go there and stay, like sleep, in the house that her father built for her when she was 14, which you can rent. You can go there right now. Let's all go to Africa together. And it was really remarkable that I could visit these places that meant so much to her. I could go to the Wilson Aerodrome where she learned to fly in 1930. I could go to the Ingong race course. All of that is still there. I was able to go to Soisambu, which is Lord Delamere's horse farm, where Beryl went in 1922 to train horses for him. I sat on the porch of the current Lord Delamere and ate lemon cake with Lord Delamere. It was like flipping nothing I had ever done before. It was the coolest thing I'd ever done. I went up in a vintage open-air biplane, and I went horseback riding through the bush, and all that would have been amazing research. It was even more amazing to me, having lived there already in my imagination. When I went up in that plane and like swooped down over the savannah, and like giraffes are scattering, what do I hear? Like the soundtrack to Out of Africa, right? And I just burst into tears. It was amazing.
You have quite an imagination.
I do. Somebody stop me. But this dress, it's giraffe.
Yes.
It's fabulous.
No accident. I'm really excited to read your book.
Oh, thank you.
And
thank you.
West with the Night has been my favorite book for years and years.
Oh, yay. I love hearing
so I'm
that.
sorry I didn't have your email address to suggest that you write about Beryl Markham. because
you would have saved me a lot of time
so
and
sorry.
suffering.
Yeah. But I've always tried to find more information on her. So I'm curious what source documents you used.
Okay, so the question, in case you couldn't hear it, was she's always been a fan of Beryl Markham, and she wanted to know what my source documents were. So, of course, I started with West with the Night, and for me, probably because I was a poet first, I need a voice. I need a voice to kind of kickstart a riff of my own voice, which is like a version. It's not Beryl's voice. Hadley's voice in The Paris Wife isn't Hadley. It's some combination of me and Hadley. And Beryl's the same. So, and then I had to learn about her life, so I went to biography. There are two really, really, really good ones. One's called Straight On Till Morning by Mary Lovell, and another one by Errol Trubinsky, called The Lives of Beryl Markham. And then I had to learn more. So I used to be an English teacher. I used to teach out of Africa. But then I already knew from reading biography that Karen Blixen was romanticizing the love story between herself and Finch Hatton. Beryl's never mentioned in the book, as I said, right? So then I had to sort of read more. So then I had to read all of her letters. They're beautiful, but they're very illuminating as well. And to reread Out of Africa, Bror Blixen, who is Karen's husband, wrote a memoir about being an African hunter. I mean, it's just fabulous, fabulous stuff. I read an amazing biography about Dennis Finch Hatton, and it just went like that. And then I had to learn about horse racing in 1924 in Kenya, and then I had to learn about flying, and sort of each piece of it came together. I wanted to know about the Happy Valley set, those louts, all that sex and gin and indiscretion. And there's this fabulous book called The Bolter about Dinah Sackville by Frances Osborne, which is fantastic. There's a book called The Ghosts of Happy Valley by Juliet Barnes. So there's a trail, and each point in my research would take me to this moment. I'm like, well, I have to know more about that. And then I would read that. I need to know more about Kenya. So I read, big chunks of Peter Matheson's The Tree Where Man Was Born. Amazing, amazing, amazing books. And I'm happy to have spent time with them. So that's my process.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm excited to read your book too.
Thank
And
you.
West with the
I
Night is also
love
my
it.
favorite book.
Thank you.
So you've done all this research and you've read a lot of these documents, but I imagine that you had questions that still weren't answered. And I'm curious, if you could ask her one question, what would it be?
Ooh. The question would be, do you think that Karen knew that you were involved with Dennis? That would be my question. So there's a scene in my novel, and in fact, the dialogue that was the most fun for me to write, and the relationship that was the most interesting and compelling to me, was the relationship between Karen and Beryl. They weren't romantically involved. They weren't sexually involved, but they were deeply emotionally involved. And they were very different women, but both like such iconoclasts and so unforgettable. I had to kick Meryl Streep out of my head, and banish her. And I had to kick Robert Redford out of my head. But the one character from Sidney Pollack's Out of Africa that would not leave was Michael Kitchen, who plays Barclay Cole, is an amazing character. Everybody has to go home and rewatch Out of Africa now. So there's a dialogue in this novel, Encircling the Sun, between Karen and Beryl, where they confront this idea that they've both been in love with the same man for many years and been friends, and they both can't have him, and he's not for the having, and all of that. And it was really fun for me to write, but I don't know if that happened. I just needed to resolve that kind of for myself. And somehow I'm destined to write about love triangles. I don't know. I'm not sure. Yes, thank you. Hi.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good.
I thought I was coming prepared. I had a question ready to ask you even before I
And I
left
already
home.
answered it?
Yeah, I was going to ask you about how you chose Beryl and how you chose the Paris wife.
Hadley, right.
Then I came and discovered that you went to the University of Michigan, and my green blood boiled, and it just threw
Are you
me
a Spartan?
off. I'm a Spartan. I'm
Do
sorry.
we have to arm wrestle now?
No, we might have to, but we could wait until
All
some of these
right.
people leave. Anyway, I thought that perhaps I would ask now if you've thought about character number 3. If your brother has provided any suggestions.
And what is he
if
doing?
Our friend here has emailed you another suggestion.
People feel very free to tell me what I should be writing about. And in fact, last night I was in Darien, Connecticut, and two of the ideas were Anne Morgan, who is J.P. Morgan's daughter. Apparently, J.P. Morgan never made a decision without consulting the tarot deck. This is what I learned last night in Darien, Connecticut. And the other idea, was Wallace Simpson. Yeah. I don't ever do an event where somebody doesn't come up and say, you need to, And that's the thing about this genre, which is both wonderful and also weird. Liz and I were just talking before this event about it. Like this genre or subgenre, biographical fiction, biofic, how's that for a, right? Fictional, memoir, whatever it is, it's interesting. And it clearly is popular because we like history. We like a little bit of history. We also want a really good story, and we want intimacy. Like if we can get history and feel grounded, and there's a context and a relationship, like someone you can ride shotgun with, and there's a reason for your being there and learning about the history. I think it's sort of delicious. I do. Do I have another idea? I have a couple of ideas, but now I know what happens when whatever, like ramming my head into a brick wall. Hopefully I've learned something and won't do that again. I'll wait for some heat and then I'll get to work.
Thank you.
Yeah. A couple more questions if there are any. Yes, ma'am. Oh, hello. See, I'm bad at this, Liz, and you're going to... Yes, thank you. Please, I'm sorry.
Having been to Paris and having been to Kenya after you finished the book, is there anything you would have changed as a result?
Yes. Even though, where's my friend? I have a good imagination. But there's, of course, all sorts of things that I wish I had known. So Beryl writes in West with the Night about Kibby, so her best childhood friend, Kibby, who she calls a Nandi. I mean, Beryl makes lots and lots of mistakes in West with the Night. And then I had to make these political decisions and, cultural decisions, like, do I correct her mistakes or do I keep them? But anyway, so Beryl had this childhood friend named Kibby, and she describes this competition that they have. And the way that they kind of try to best each other at jumping as high as they possibly can while standing still. And that a Kipsigis moron, a warrior in training, should be able to jump as high as his own shoulder, right? From standing there, right? And they try to best each other, and I think it's just some game. And then I went to the Masai Mara and was able to visit a Maasai village and see an Ngoma, to see a dance. And they're beautiful, as you might imagine. And this thing starts happening, which is that the warriors start jumping and the other ones are singing and humming and thrumming, and my chest is vibrating with the noise they're making and the fire's going, and it's incredible. And they start ululating and jumping, and they can really do this. Jump as high as their shoulders, and it's beautiful to watch. And then I realized the women aren't doing it. Only the men are doing it. It's what warriors do. And Beryl was doing this. Beryl was a warrior. She had this particular niche as a young girl because her mother left, because she was abandoned, because her father neglected her, because she had to forge this identity. She was a particular kind of girl, and I would have massaged that more. And there are details like that I learned from being there, but still, it was like, it was amazing.
Well, you could write an edited.
Oh, right. Yeah, it's the afterword.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Thank you. Good question. Hi.
I have two quick questions. One, just because I'm impatient, talk a little about the title, Circling the Sun, and what that means.
Oh,
and the
okay.
second question, which builds on her saying you could edit Beryl, was, do you think that she wrote West with the Night?
Okay. Good questions. So the title, Circling the Sun, came very late in the game after lots and lots of conference calls, and everybody hated all the titles that I had suggested. And what it means really is that I'm sort of toying with the Icarus myth, right? Sort of like what I love about Beryl is that she pushes back against the world, you know, and the way that she makes life in a way kind of difficult for herself by fighting for independence and freedom, and for like plunging herself in this relationship, which is a mistake, and she makes lots of mistakes, and she in a way can't help herself because she is unapologetically herself come hell or high water. And I feel like Finch Hatton is that person too. And so there's this idea of flying too close to the sun, and what happens when you do that? Well, bad things happen, but you learn something. And after Dennis Finch Hatton dies in this fiery plane crash in 1931, oh, sorry, spoiler alert. You've seen the movie. You guys know this happens. It's history. Beryl takes up flying in her grief, and it changes everything. It changes her life. So I just really loved that image, the Icarus myth, you know, flying too close to the sun. The second question is, gossip and speculation and innuendo followed Beryl Markham for all of her days, and she was famously closed-lipped. Basically, if you believe everything you read, I just wrote this in a piece for Town and Country, you believe that she was an illiterate alcoholic who rarely, if ever, got off her back. Seriously. If you believe all the gossip, she apparently slept with everyone, you know, who ever lived. But the other thing that happens is Raoul Schumacher, who was Beryl's third husband, just happened to be a third-rate Hollywood ghostwriter who didn't really write much of anything that anyone can find. And he claimed, when in a moment of being ticked at her, that he wrote it. And people just believe that he wrote it. And when I was in Kenya, I had lunch with her second husband is Mansfield Markham. I had lunch with his godson. And of course, I was ready for all the bad Beryl stories. I don't know. I was just curious. I wanted to meet him. I had lunch with him, and he just sort of trotted out all the gossip, just like right off the conveyor belt. Well, you know she didn't write that book. You know her son Jarvis wasn't Mansfield's son. He was Prince Harry's. You know, like all the stuff, all the gossip. And so I had the ammo. I'm like, actually, we happen to know that she had already delivered 16 chapters of West with the Night before she ever met Raoul Schumacher, and he wouldn't even believe me then. I just felt like people love the gossip. But there was this great article in The Guardian, like last week, and it's sort of coming around again, this whole speculation that perhaps Truman Capote wrote To Kill a Mockingbird, right? Ridiculous. And the writer, and I'm forgetting her name, sort of says something really full of moxie. She's like, why is it always the women who can't write their own books? Like, it's never the men who don't write their own books. And then she says this great thing about Beryl. She's like, she could outfly and outride men, but write well? Impossible. Yeah, love it. Yeah, are we good? Thank you so much. I had an amazing time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll line up right here.